A Living Doll by Fiona Dobson, read by Jules Sanderson. This is part 2. I sit writing these words in my study. As I think of that remote village, I can almost smell the breeze moving through the elephant grass, its soft susurrance so peaceful, reflecting none of the menace that was hidden within those gently swaying stalks. As night turned to day that following dawn, I packed things into the Land Rover to make the 6-hour drive back to the capital. Evelyn, tired after the previous day's exertions, was silent and evasive with each question I asked her about her peculiar meeting with Ashwali. She threw her belongings together in a manner that reflected her ill temper. No one could call Evelyn a morning person. Into her small collection of travelling supplies and notes, I noticed a black ebony box. I'd never seen this before, and commented on it. I'd have forgotten all about it, had her response not been so vociferous. She clutched the box to her chest and muttered something about it being an artifact she wanted to show one of the anthropology students at the university to see if they could identify its purpose. I had learned it was best not to press Evelyn about these things in the mornings, far better to wait for the inevitable explanation that would come in the evening when, with enthusiasm and genuine excitement, she'd be sure to share the activities of her day. Except on this occasion, no explanation came. And so it went forgotten into the past, quickly lost in the events that followed. I filed my notes and drawings at the company office in town the following morning, and leaving the drafting office found myself cornered by Marchant, the company director. I was a little surprised to see him in the office at all, as I seemed to be the only person there. It was so uncharacteristically quiet that several of the African staff were milling around looking uncharacteristically bored and unoccupied. "Have you had your coffee?" Marchant asked, to my surprise. He never condescended to have coffee with me before. Being a surveyor, I was not really one of the inside team. My presence in the country was limited to the time it took to draft the plans for the installation I was working on. In most cases, this would be a few months, and then I'd be off home. Few of the permanent staff would form connections with the likes of me, as we were so itinerant. "No," I said. "I was about to go over the road for one," I said. "Quite right," said Marchant. "Let's go together." The reason for this deft interception became clearer as we stepped onto the veranda of the Stanley Hotel. He glanced about, conspiratorial, and then, sure we were not to be overheard, sat down in one of the wicker chairs and looked at me sternly. "Now listen, Valentine. I know you were up country, and I'm damned pleased to see you back here. I spoke to the rest of the European staff last night. You're the odd man out, of course, but then you surveyor Johnnies always are, aren't you?" I stared back at him, not sure what the correct response might be. "So you're not to repeat this in front of the locals, none of them, understand?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "This afternoon the Duchess of Kent is going to land at the quay. It's scheduled to leave tomorrow after refuelling, but that's not how it's going to go down. All the company staff and some of the BP boys are going to board her, hand baggage only, and we're clearing out an hour after she docks. There's going to be the last few embassy staff on board too." "But why?" I asked. The Duchess of Kent was a small steam packet that ran up and down the coast, serving the settlements all the way south, past Mombasa, all the way to Dar es Salaam. "Because the embassies told us they can't guarantee our safety anymore. They think the capital will fall in the next 3 days, and we shouldn't be around to see it. Isn't that a bit of an overreaction?" Marchant looked at me coldly and then continued. "It's going to be a bloodbath. We know a little bit about the man who's coming in, and we know what he did down the coast. It's been hushed up, of course, not to spread panic, but this is it. We're getting out, and we'll be leaving just about everything here. Of course, the lot will be looted. The embassy staff drank the last of their wine cellar last night, and that's never a good sign." "Should I get anything from the office?" I asked. "My drawings?" "Forget your drawings. Get your stuff together and quietly make your way to the quay for 2 o'clock. Don't say goodbye to your friends. Don't talk to your staff. Get your stuff and be on the quay for 2. The sooner we clear away, the better. I don't want to have to leave you. We won't be waiting a moment past 3 o'clock. And that was how it was. 200 years of development and a few hours' notice, and we were gone. Arriving back at our compound, I was greeted with the news that my son was poorly, and Evelyn's mood was terse. He should stay in bed today, she said, and busied herself with preparing a glass of lemonade for him. Evelyn, I said, waiting for the maid to leave the room, we have to talk. I'm very busy, darling, she said, cutting me off. I've got some things to document. That can wait, I said. No, it can't, she replied, steamrolling my objection. It can wait, Evelyn, I insisted. Pack your bag and get things ready to move. Get Stephen ready. We've been instructed to move out. She stared at me blankly. The embassy's clearing out too. We don't have a choice. The next few hours Evelyn spent in her room alone, packing things for herself and Stephen. I put a small suitcase of things together, always having travelled light. I strapped the theodolite to my bag and threw 2 or 3 books into the case, knowing we'd be waiting around a while as the steamer made its way south. At 2 p.m. we stepped up the gangplank, carrying 2 bags, a sick child, a theodolite, and that unusual black box Evelyn decided she'd bring with her. It would break my heart, but 3 days later, only 2 of us would disembark in Mombasa. It still hurts to even think about my son's death, so I shall not go into great detail. Cerebral malaria is a very short story, particularly in infants. The fitful sleep, the coma, and then terrible temperature, all crescendoed, and finally he was at peace. Things had happened very rapidly after that. The funeral, a short wait in Kenya, and then being back in England, and adjusting to life without my child. It all rather blurred into one long, dark memory I'd rather not recount. The life of a surveyor is one filled with deadlines for other people, or the company, and I soon found myself gainfully redeployed to a division of the company that handles the larger gas stations, drafting plans for petrol storage tanks and pumping units. If you've driven along the M4 or the M1 or the M5, you've certainly stopped for petrol at one of mine. Eventually I found a place to live in the quiet of the home counties, and my regular commutes to London or a work site became another piece in the jigsaw puzzle that made up my life. It would be fair to say that we thrived. I worked hard, and Evelyn pursued her passion for unusual spirituality. She even joined a yoga studio and threw herself into her practices. It all happened so swiftly, and to the outside observer it all looked so normal. The end of the foreign assignments was simply part of life, as colonies shrugged off their ties to companies like my employer. It was a sign of the times, and there was nothing to be done about it. Being positioned in some foreign land simply became a thing of the past. But there was something the outside observer would have missed. It was hidden in the shadowy corners of my darkest self. Something more personal, and in some ways more sinister. Perhaps it was the shock of the death of my son, I don't know, though that is how I thought of it at the time. What I'm about to describe was probably always in there, waiting to emerge, who can tell? Shortly after our return from Africa, I found myself feeling a little different. At first I thought it was the climate or something. Silly, I know. However, there was no doubt about it. I found my mind wandering. I didn't feel my old self at all. And then the dreams started. At the time, Evelyn was writing her book, and she'd sometimes disappear off to one university or another to rifle their archives. She'd take a couple of days to travel to Cambridge and use their library. Fortunately, she had friends living nearby, and sometimes she'd stay over. Particularly on those nights, I'd find my mind drawn to unfamiliar thoughts. I even found myself dreaming, seeing myself changing little by little. The dreams were remarkably vivid. Initially, it was just on the odd occasion, but before long it became every night. I'd be there in Africa, but dressed in women's clothes. Perhaps it would be as the lady of a large house, with servants, and me presiding over it all as a woman. Other times I was a village wife in a remote African village, and sometimes it was a woman I might see in the street any time of the day or night. But every time it was as a woman. I think what was most surprising about it was that I didn't mind. In fact, I began to enjoy it more and more. until it was as arousing a sexual experience as I'd ever had. The attraction of it grew slowly but insistently, until I'd find excuses to skulk around department stores, checking out women's clothing departments. The dreams would come almost every night. I'd be there dressed and living out my life as a woman. I could see myself at work, or shopping, or driving home, and always in a dress. I could almost feel the weight of my breasts as I leaned forward to reach across my drafting table, or getting up to get a coffee. It was quite remarkable how swiftly these thoughts came on. And yet I welcomed them. I experienced my first case of somnambulance and amnesia about a year after we returned to England. I won't make a big deal about it. In those days it was unusual to go and see a therapist, unheard of even. So the troubling events that began to happen became something I would work through myself. How best to describe this? I can only say that one night I literally woke up in the local high street at 3 a.m, in light rain, barefoot and disoriented. I had absolutely no idea how I'd got there. With the onset of wakefulness, I looked about, trying to understand how I'd got there. I was confused, and perhaps the only way to help you understand how it felt was that it was as though I'd been drunk, fallen asleep, and woken somewhere that, at first, seemed unfamiliar. That would all be fine, except I hadn't had a drink, and I'd obviously walked here, judging by the state of my feet. Gradually I got my bearings. The railway station I used to get to work each morning was just up the road. The street lamps cast their yellow hue on closed stores, and I could see a night bus arriving in the distance. I couldn't explain my presence here at all, nor could I explain the fact that I was wearing a long dress, dampened with rain. Beneath it I could feel cotton panties and a bra. As I hurried the mile back to my house, I tried to find an explanation, but came up with nothing. Arriving at the house, I saw the living room light on. Although Evelyn kept strange hours, this seemed particularly odd. With no key, I knocked on the front door, and the door was smartly opened. Evelyn looked at me. In that moment one thing struck me as she looked at her bedraggled husband. She seemed neither shocked nor surprised. Her reaction was one of quiet amusement.